200 million people died in 4 years. Not from war, not from famine, from something invisible. The year is 1347. In October, 12 ships arrive in Sicily. The dock workers who greet them see a horror beyond imagining. Decks littered with corpses, sailors covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus. The authorities order the ships away immediately. But it's already too late. The damage is done. In the next 4 years, this invisible enemy will kill more people than every war in human history combined. It will erase half the world's population. It will end civilizations. And it all started with 12 ships, carrying cargo from the east. This is the story of the Black Death. The 1400s were Europe's golden age of connection. After the Great Famine of the 1310s had passed, populations were recovering, cities were growing. Markets thrived on goods that flowed along trade routes stretching from London to Beijing. Venice commanded fleets that sailed to Alexandria and Constantinople. Genoese merchants had built colonies on the Black Sea coast, where east met west. Italian bankers financed kingdoms. The world had never been more interconnected, more prosperous, more alive with possibility. This interconnection was Europe's greatest strength. Roads linked every village, ships crossed every sea. A merchant in England could wear silk from China. A peasant in France could season his bread with pepper from India. The medieval world was not isolated. It was a web, intricate and vast. Doctors in this world believed they understood disease. Following the ancient Greeks, they taught that illness came from an imbalance of 4 humors in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Too much blood caused fever. The cure was bloodletting, opening a vein to restore balance. This knowledge had been passed down for over 1,000 years. It was trusted, unquestioned. The church offered spiritual certainty. God's plan governed all things. Suffering brought people closer to salvation. When disaster struck, it was either punishment for sin or a test of faith. No one yet understood germs. No one knew that rats carried fleas, that fleas carried bacteria, that bacteria could devastate empires. According to a physician of the time, disease traveled through the air as poisonous vapors, or spread when the dying released evil spirits with their final breath. But in Caffa, a city of 16,000 souls on the Crimean coast, something was already spreading. And Europe's greatest strength, its vast network of trade and travel, was about to become the pathway for its darkest catastrophe. Caffa had been under siege for months. The Mongol army of Johnny Beg, Khan of the Golden Horde, surrounded the city walls, cutting off supplies. Inside, Genoese defenders held firm behind fortifications that had protected them for years. It was a standoff neither side could win. Then the disease appeared in the Mongol camp. A notary named Gabriele de Musi, writing from Italy, recorded what happened next. The Mongol soldiers began dying in staggering numbers. Swellings erupted in their groins and armpits, followed by fever and delirium. It was, he wrote, as though arrows were raining down from heaven to strike and crush them. Thousands died each day. The desperate Mongol commanders made a choice that would echo through history. They loaded the corpses of plague victims into trebuchets and hurled them over the city walls. Whether this truly happened or was simply the story that survivors told, we may never know for certain. Modern scholars debate it still, but this much is documented. The plague entered Caffa, and the Genoese defenders, realizing they could not escape it, fled to their ships. Among them was a sailor we might call Marco, 28 years old, broad-shouldered from years pulling ropes and hoisting cargo. He had a wife waiting in Genoa, a daughter he had not seen in 3 years. He boarded one of 12 galleys, preparing to sail west, relieved to be leaving the death behind. What Marco did not know was that he was already infected. For the first few days, plague victims show no symptoms. They go about their lives, unaware that death is already inside them. Marco worked the sails as the ship crossed the Black Sea. He ate with his crewmates. He slept in the hold, surrounded by 40 other men. By the time the ships reached Constantinople, Marco felt the first signs: a dull ache in his groin, fatigue that sleep could not cure. He said nothing, afraid the captain would leave him ashore. The swelling came next, a lump beneath his arm, growing larger each day, painful to touch. His skin darkened around it, turning purple, then black. A ship's physician examined him. The doctor had trained in Salerno, studying texts by Galen and Hippocrates. He diagnosed an excess of blood and prescribed bloodletting. Using a lancet, he opened a vein in Marco's arm and let the blood flow into a bowl. Marco grew weaker. The fever came, relentless and burning. On the 7th day, somewhere between Crete and Sicily, Marco died. His body was wrapped in canvas and pushed overboard. His belongings were distributed among the crew. No one understood that Marco's blood had contaminated the physician's tools. No one realized that fleas from Marco's clothing were already feeding on new hosts. While Marco's crewmates grieved, the disease was spreading through the ship. One by one, men began to sicken. By the time the 12 galleys approached the harbor at Messina in October of 1347, most of the sailors aboard were either dead or dying. If you're finding this as gripping as I am, subscribe. We're covering history's deadliest pandemics every week. The people of Messina gathered at the docks as the ships arrived. They came to greet merchants, to hear news from the east, to see what goods the galleys carried. What they saw instead was a vision from hell. Bodies littered the decks. Those sailors still alive were covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Some were delirious with fever, others could barely stand. The harbor authorities ordered the ships away immediately, but the damage was done. By the time the galleys left the port, the disease had already jumped to the dock workers, the merchants, the curious onlookers who had come too close. Within days, people in Messina began falling ill. The symptoms were unmistakable. First came fever and chills. Then the buboes, swellings in the groin or armpit that grew to the size of apples. The skin around them turned black. Some victims developed spots that spread across their bodies. They coughed blood. They vomited. Most died within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms appearing. A physician named Guy de Chauliac, working in Avignon, described treating victims. He lanced the buboes, draining the pus in the belief this would expel the poison from the body. Sometimes the patient went into shock and died on the table. Other times, the opened boil released such infection that death came even faster. Bloodletting continued as the standard treatment. Doctors opened veins, believing they were restoring balance. In truth, they were weakening patients who desperately needed their strength. Other remedies emerged from desperation. Physicians burned aromatic herbs, thinking the smoke would purify poisoned air. They prescribed medicines of crushed emeralds, powdered pearls, gold dust. They told patients to avoid bathing, to carry flowers, to flee to the countryside. Nothing worked. The plague moved with terrifying speed. From Messina, it spread across Sicily in weeks. In January of 1348, ships from Caffa reached Genoa and Venice, carrying the pestilence to Italy's greatest cities. A few weeks later, an outbreak in Pisa became the gateway to northern Italy. By late January, a merchant ship arrived in Marseille. The French port city was one of the Mediterranean's busiest, goods and people flowing in and out each day. The plague exploded through Marseille like fire through dry timber. By spring, it was racing up the Rhone Valley toward Paris. The disease followed trade routes with mathematical precision. Florence, Venice, Genoa, Italy's wealthy city-states fell one after another. By June of 1348, the plague had reached Paris, capital of the French kingdom. It struck Bordeaux in the same month. In England, ships from Gascony brought it to the port of Melcombe Regis on the southern coast. A chronicler named Robert of Avesbury tracked its arrival in London. On All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1348, the first cases appeared in the capital. The disease was most virulent, he wrote, from Candlemas in February to Easter in April. By summer, it had spread to the north. Everywhere it struck, people turned to faith. Churches overflowed with the terrified and the dying. Priests held masses day and night, hearing final confessions, administering last rites. But the churches became death traps. People packed together in confined spaces, breathing the same air, touching the same holy water. The plague raced through congregations. Priests died in staggering numbers, so many that there were not enough clergy left to perform burial rites. Some sought someone to blame. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells, that they were part of a conspiracy to destroy Christendom. In Germany and Switzerland, Jewish communities were rounded up and tortured until they confessed to crimes they never committed. Thousands were burned alive. This scapegoating was driven by fear, by the need to find meaning in meaningless death. Others turned to extreme penance. Groups of flagellants appeared, men who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves with leather straps studded with metal spikes. They believed their suffering would appease God's wrath. Crowds gathered to watch these public displays of pain. The flagellants spread the disease wherever they went. Governments tried to act. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, attempting to fix wages and prevent peasants from demanding higher pay as workers became scarce. It was a futile gesture. The old order was already crumbling. By the summer of 1349, the plague had reached York in northern England. It ravaged Wales and Ireland. Scottish armies, thinking God was punishing the English, invaded from the north and caught the plague themselves. By 1350, the disease had spread through Scotland. Everywhere the pattern was the same. The disease arrived by ship or traveler. It exploded through the population in weeks. The wealthy fled to their country estates. The poor huddled in their homes, helpless. Bodies piled in streets because there was no one left to bury them. In some cities, mass graves were dug before the plague even arrived, as authorities prepared for inevitable death. The world that had been so interconnected, so proud of its trade and travel, watched those same networks become highways for extinction. A merchant sailing from London to Bordeaux carried death with him. A pilgrim walking from Rome to Jerusalem left plague in every town he passed through. The very bonds that had made Europe prosperous were now the chains that dragged it toward oblivion. And the plague kept spreading, unstoppable, insatiable, blind to prayer or wealth or royal blood. By the summer of 1348, the markets of Paris stood empty. Streets that once bustled with merchants and craftsmen fell silent except for the tolling of church bells, bells that rang constantly, marking death after death, until the sound became almost unbearable, and authorities ordered them stopped. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio watched his city transform into a graveyard. 90% of the population would die. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Survivors who dared venture outside wrapped cloth around their faces and carried flowers to mask the stench of decay. Bodies lay where they fell. There were not enough living to carry the dead. In London, mass burials became routine. At the height of the outbreak, 200 bodies were interred each day at the East Smithfield Cemetery, dug specifically for plague victims on land purchased by Ralph Stratford, Bishop of London. Workers laid corpses in trenches, layer upon layer, trying to keep pace with death's harvest. A physician in Avignon touched his patient's forehead to check for fever. By evening, the physician himself was burning. By morning, both doctor and patient were gone. This happened again and again, healers becoming victims, their knowledge useless against an enemy they could not understand. The plague made no distinction between rich and poor, though the wealthy had better chances of escape. In Bordeaux, Princess Joan of England, daughter of King Edward III, waited in her chambers. She was 16 years old, traveling to marry Pedro of Castile. When the plague reached the city, she was moved to a small village nearby. It did not matter. On September 2nd, 1348, she died. The marriage alliance died with her. Villages vanished. In County Durham, the village of West Thickley was erased completely, every resident dead. In France, thousands of settlements were abandoned, their inhabitants gone, leaving only empty houses and untended fields. Nature reclaimed these places. Forests grew where farms had been. Centuries later, aerial photography after World War I would rediscover these lost villages, shadows of communities that plague had deleted from the map. By the time the first wave subsided in 1351, the world had been transformed. In Europe alone, between 50 and 70 million people had died. This was not 30% of the population, as some early estimates claimed. Modern analysis suggests 40 to 60% perished. In some regions, the death toll reached 90%. Worldwide, the numbers are almost incomprehensible. Of 500 million people alive in 1347, somewhere between 155 and 200 million died. Nearly half the world's population was gone in 4 years. From a bacterium invisible to the human eye, carried by fleas, spread by rats and humans along trade routes that had once been symbols of progress and prosperity. The silence that followed was profound. Cities that had teemed with life now echoed with emptiness. Fields lay unharvested because there was no one left to work them. Ships rotted in harbors. Churches stood abandoned, their priests dead, their congregations vanished. And then, slowly, tentatively, something began to change. The numbers tell the immediate story. Europe's population, which may have reached 75 million before the plague, had been cut nearly in half. England lost between 40 and 60% of its people. Some monasteries recorded mortality rates of 90%. Monks living in close quarters, tending to each other, dying together. But the plague's legacy was not just in how many died. It was in what happened to those who survived. Before 1348, Europe's feudal system had stood unchallenged for centuries. At the bottom were serfs, peasants legally bound to the land, forced to work for their lords in exchange for protection and a small plot to farm. They had no freedom of movement, no bargaining power. There were always more peasants than work, so they could be replaced, exploited, treated as little more than property. The plague shattered this equation. Suddenly, there were not enough workers to plant fields, harvest crops, tend livestock. Lords who had commanded dozens of laborers now struggled to find even a few, and those who survived realized, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that they had power. Peasants began to demand wages. They negotiated better working conditions. They refused to work for lords who would not pay fair prices for labor. A chronicler from Rochester complained that aristocrats now had to pay triple wages, and worse. Some nobles were forced to work their own fields. This was written as a horror, a violation of the natural order. In truth, it was a revolution. The English Parliament tried to stop it. In 1351, they passed the Statute of Laborers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, and forbid workers from leaving their villages to seek better opportunities. But the law was unenforceable. There were simply not enough people. Lords who wanted their fields worked had to compete for labor, and competition meant higher wages, better treatment, freedom. For the first time, serfs could negotiate. They could leave cruel masters and find new ones who would treat them better. They could demand to be paid in money rather than goods. Some saved enough to buy their freedom entirely. The rigid hierarchy that had defined European society for generations began to crack. This shift accelerated over the following decades. Wages continued to rise. Rents fell as land became abundant and labor scarce. Peasants could afford better housing, better food, even small luxuries that had been unthinkable before the plague. The death of millions had, paradoxically, improved life for the survivors. The changes went deeper than economics. Urbanization increased as people moved from depopulated countryside to cities offering better opportunities. Between 1350 and 1400, the percentage of Europeans living in towns rose from 8% to 11%. A middle class began to emerge. Craftsmen, merchants, small landowners who were neither peasant nor noble, but something in between. The feudal bonds that had tied peasants to lords for life weakened and eventually broke. Wage labor replaced hereditary service. This laid the foundation for early capitalism, for economies based on money and markets rather than land and loyalty. The old world was dying. Something new was being born from its ruins. The changes sparked resistance. In 1381, English peasants revolted, demanding an end to serfdom and fairer taxes. The revolt was crushed, but its underlying cause, the empowerment of common people, could not be stopped. The genie was out of the bottle. In modern times, archaeologists have uncovered the physical evidence of plague's devastation. At the East Smithfield site in London, over 2,000 bodies were excavated from mass graves used between 1348 and 1349. In 2011, a team led by Kirsten Boss at McMaster University extracted DNA from 4 of these skeletons and reconstructed the full genome of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused the Black Death. The ancient strain, they discovered, was ancestral to most modern plague strains. It sits at the root of the evolutionary tree of Y. pestis that still causes infections today. This confirmed what historical records had suggested. The Black Death was indeed bubonic plague, the same disease that killed millions in later centuries, the same disease that still exists in pockets around the world. But the DNA raised as many questions as it answered. The medieval strain was not significantly more virulent than modern forms. So, why was the Black Death so much more deadly? Part of the answer lies in circumstances. Malnutrition, poor sanitation, close living quarters, total ignorance of germ theory. Part lies in the pneumonic form of plague, which spreads through the air and kills even faster than the bubonic form. And part remains mysterious. Further research in 2021 showed evidence that the plague may have shaped human evolution itself. Analysis of genomes from medieval victims, compared with modern populations, suggests natural selection favored certain immune system genes in the centuries after the Black Death. People whose ancestors survived may carry genetic advantages that help them resist infection. The plague did not just kill people, it changed the species. Today, if you visit London, you can walk past the site where those mass graves once lay. The East Smithfield Cemetery is now covered by buildings, the dead lying beneath the foundations of the modern city. Throughout Europe, plague pits remain hidden under streets and parks, unmarked graves holding thousands of victims whose names are lost to history. But their legacy lives in the world they left behind, a world where common people claimed power, where feudalism collapsed, where the seeds of the modern age were planted in soil enriched by the bodies of the dead. So, what did we learn? History remembers the Black Death as pure catastrophe. Half a world's population erased in 4 years, suffering beyond measure, civilizations brought to their knees. And it was all of that. The grief was real, the loss was incomprehensible. Millions of individual tragedies, each one a universe of pain. But from that darkness came an unexpected truth. The very thing that made medieval Europe strong, its networks of trade, its interconnected cities, its roads and ships binding the world together, became the mechanism of its near destruction. Strength and vulnerability were two sides of the same coin. And then, from the ruins, something new emerged. The peasants who survived found themselves with power they had never possessed. The rigid hierarchies that had seemed eternal crumbled. Labor became valuable. Freedom became possible. The modern world, with its wage labor, its social mobility, its recognition that even common people have rights, was born in the aftermath of plague. This pattern repeats throughout human history. Pandemics do not just kill, they reshape societies. They force change. They reveal which systems are resilient and which are fragile. In 2020, when another pandemic swept the globe, we saw the same dynamics play out. Interconnection enabling spread, inequality determining who suffered most, survivors emerging into a changed world. We learn, perhaps, that connection carries risk, that our greatest strengths can become our greatest vulnerabilities, that systems we think are permanent can collapse in months, and that from collapse can come transformation. But we also learn this: humans endure. We bury our dead, we grieve our losses, and we rebuild. The Black Death killed half the known world, and yet humanity recovered. We not only survived, we changed, adapted, grew stronger in unexpected ways. The plague is still with us. Yersinia pestis still infects hundreds of people each year in places around the world. But we understand it now. We have antibiotics. We have public health systems born from lessons learned in earlier pandemics. We know how disease spreads and how to stop it. The medieval world had none of these advantages. They fought an invisible enemy with bleeding bowls and prayer. Half of them died. The other half rebuilt civilization. In the empty streets, the mass graves, the villages reclaimed by forest, there is a message. Pandemics will come again. They always have. They always will. But so will survivors. So will rebuilding. So will the stubborn insistence of humans to continue, to adapt, to find hope even in the darkest times. The 12 ships that arrived in Messina in October 1347 carried more than death. They carried a lesson written in blood and loss, that we are all connected, for better and worse, that our strength lies in connection, and so does our vulnerability, that catastrophe can break a world, but survivors will build a new one from the pieces. And in the ruins, we rebuild.